pandemic has forced Americans to confront numerous and compounding tragedies. Almost 450,000 Americans have been killed, millions of livelihoods have been upended, and millions of American kids, especially those who attend public school, have been robbed of an entire year and counting of proper school. Despite heroic efforts from students, parents, and teachers, so-called remote learning has proven a poor substitute for the real thing. Research suggests that even if the average remote learning student had gotten back in the classroom last month, they'd already have missed multiple months' worth of learning compared to a normal year. 40% of high schoolers in St. Paul now have failing grades. In Houston, it's 40% of all students. Tampa's school district has reportedly just lost track of thousands of kids altogether. And this pain isn't spread equally. The worst has fallen on the most vulnerable, including lower-income households, students of color, and students with special needs and their families. The fallout isn't just academic. Replacing the structure, friendships, and activities of school with isolated screen time has predictably caused spikes in mental health concerns. Schools normally keep an eye on kids with challenging home lives and are too often the most reliable source of hot meals, and on and on. We know with certainty now that K through 12 schooling cannot move online indefinitely like a white-collar workplace. It's more like routine medical procedures, something that can be postponed a few weeks in a pinch, but which our society really cannot do without. And some families aren't having to. Many private and parochial schools have been in person since the fall. Many European countries have kept kids in schools nearly the whole time. But in places across America where public education depends on the whims of a powerful public sector union, the best interests of children have often come dead last. As the months have rolled by and the data have poured in, it's become clear that schools can open safely. Just last week, CDC researchers affirmed, quote, "With proper prevention efforts, we can keep transmission in schools and education settings quite low." This confirms what scientists were observing as far back as October, when it reported, quote, "Transmission by young children to adults seems to be negligible as long as safety measures are in place." Dr. Fauci, whose expertise was supposed to guide the Biden administration's whole approach, said last week, quote, "We can keep the children in school and get them back to school safely." That's Dr. Fauci. An administration that puts facts and science first would be conducting a full court press to open schools. Federal funding is not an obstacle. That's more goalpost moving. Congress has poured more than $110 billion into making education safe. As of last week, states and local school districts had only spent about $4 billion of the roughly $68 billion we set aside for K through 12 schools. That leaves $64 billion in the pipeline already. And remember, science tells us that schools are largely made safe with simple precautions. Science is not the obstacle. Federal money is not the obstacle. The obstacle is a lack of willpower, not among students, not among parents, just among the rich, powerful unions that donate huge sums to Democrats and get a stranglehold over education in many communities. Apparently, big labor's talking points have already displaced Dr. Fauci as the White House go-to source. The President's Chief of Staff keeps saying we need even more massive federal funding before teachers can go back. There's no scientific basis for that, none whatsoever. The goalpost moving doesn't stop with money. In several places, these unions sought to elbow toward the front of the line for vaccinations, only to turn around and say, thanks for the vaccinations, but don't think these will necessarily get our folks back in the classroom anytime soon. Too often, local officials just roll over and submit to these tactics. In my hometown of Louisville, Kentucky, the largest school district in the state has a union-funded Board of Education vice chair. He's now saying that even if all school personnel get vaccines, he'd still be reluctant to open schools. In San Francisco, the 28-year-old Board of Education president, 28 years old, argued a few days ago that vulnerable kids aren't really missing out on learning, they're just learning different things. And it's the system's fault for not measuring all of the valuable cultural experiences they've had while getting stuck at home. What nonsense. Families are losing patience, and fast. We could not function with remote police, or remote firefighters, or remote dental surgeons, and we'd never pretend otherwise. Kids, parents, and a lot of talented teachers have given online learning their all. But we'll be deluding ourselves if we continue to accept this pale shadow of proper schooling when all the science, all of it, points the other way. No more goalpost moving. States and districts have got to follow the science and get American education back on track. Now, on a related matter, in the past year, Congress has worked together to pass five major rescue packages on a bipartisan basis. The Democratic leaders spent months saying that any pandemic relief should pass with broad bipartisan support. He said last July, quote, "Sitting in your own office, writing a bill, and then demanding the other side support it is not anyone's idea of bipartisanship." But yesterday, less than a day after several Senate Republicans spent literally 2 hours meeting with President Biden, Senate Democrats plowed ahead with a party line vote to set the table for a partisan jam. The new president talks a lot about unity, but his White House staff and congressional leadership are working with a different playbook. We'll be discussing the facts on schools, on jobs, and on health care in depth in the days to come. But the rushed budget process that will play out this week is exactly the wrong path toward making law. Senate Republicans will be ready and waiting with a host of amendments to improve the rushed procedural step that's being jammed through. We'll be getting senators on the record about whether taxpayers should fund checks for illegal immigrants, whether Democrats should raise taxes on small businesses in the midst of this historic crisis, and whether generous federal funding should pour into school districts where the unions refuse to let schools open. And this is just a small taste. The American people will see Republicans are focused on smart and responsible policies to reopen the country. And they'll see Democrats who seem desperate to make their first act in power the same kind of massive, partisan, poorly targeted borrowing spree that permanently wounded the last Democratic presidency right out of the gate.